Hey there, and welcome back to this series on productivity systems. This time we're going to take a look at the Kanban methodology, which is another system that I personally enjoy because it is still a very simple approach, but now we're focusing more on process-oriented systems instead of just task-oriented systems. So what that means is instead of focusing on doing one particular activity after the other, basically completing a checklist, the system is more focused around an entire process and making sure that it's running efficiently. So let's get started with a quick intro. The Kanban methodology was actually developed by the Toyota car company in the 1940s. As you can imagine, it was designed for manufacturing and it has since been adapted for productivity and project management. So why has it made its way from manufacturing cars all the way to personal productivity and product management? There are some key ideas that make it very useful, and whether or not you decide to use a Kanban system, these ideas you can definitely adapt into whatever process you already have, either for yourself or if you're working as part of a team. So for example, one of the key ideas behind the Kanban system is that it allows you to visualize your work. And in just a moment, I'm going to switch over to that so you can take a look at an example on the right-hand side. So here we go. This is just a very simple example of what a Kanban board could look like. And again, I'm just doing this in workflow because it's very convenient. We're already in here. So let me just show you how that would look like. So the system itself is pretty simple. You have a series of columns, and then you have cards inside of those columns that you're moving from one side to the other, usually from the left to the right, as a task goes through different stages, starting from the backlog, which is basically just a big bucket of things that you need to get done, moving over to do, which is lining up the tasks that you're going to be working on next, and then over to in progress, which are the active tasks. And then depending on whatever the process might be like, it might move into an additional column, which is where that work is reviewed, or another person then takes what you've completed and then does something with it. And then after a couple of more columns, perhaps, depending on how complex the process is, it'll end up in some sort of a done or an archive column. So that's essentially it. You're just moving cards across columns on a board. So getting back to the key ideas, it lets you visualize your work. So this is a bit different from a to-do list where things are listed in a vertical fashion, and it's a little hard to tell what is being worked on, what are the different stages of the different tasks, especially if you're working within a team or with other people. You're collaborating and perhaps you have to do some part of the work and then hand it off to another person on the team. It's a little bit hard to do if you're using something that's more linear, like just a checklist. So the Kanban board allows you to see the different stages, what is their current status. Another important idea behind the Kanban methodology is that it allows you to limit the work in progress. This can be useful when you're doing it by yourself, but it's especially useful when you're working within a team. Because for example, as you can see right here, I've got under the to-do column, I've got a little number 2, and then in progress number 2, and then in review 3. So what those numbers actually mean is that this column can only have a maximum of 2 cards. And so in this case, I would have actually violated my own rule because I'm only supposed to have 2 tasks that are next in the to-do list. Now, the way that you set these up really depends on the type of work that you're doing. But as you can imagine, this is a really good way to prevent any one person on the team being overwhelmed by seeing a list of 10 things that they need to do and not having a clear idea of what is the top priority for them at any given moment. So this allows the person to focus on just the current task that they're supposed to be working on, see what's coming up, and everybody else on the team is able to see that. So there's a lot of transparency on what everyone's working on, what they're working on next, and it prevents people from being overwhelmed because you can't just dump all the different things that a person is supposed to do and fill this column up. So it's easy for everyone on the team to know what everyone's working on. And if they're ever curious, they can just check the board and see, oh, they're working on this. That's why they haven't been able to do this other thing. Once they're done with that, then they'll move on to this next thing. So it makes it easy for everyone on the team to know what you're currently working on and why you're busy. Next, it helps manage the flow. So in this example that I have, very simple. It's just a backlog, to do, in progress, review, and done. But like I mentioned, depending on the type of process you're doing, let's say you have some sort of a creative process where there are multiple review steps, or one of the first steps is perhaps writing some content. Let's say one person on the team is responsible for writing the copy for a book, and then another person on the team is responsible for creating illustrations for the book. A third person is responsible for editing. So it allows you to visualize that process and see how different parts of that activity go through the different stages until they end up where they're complete. It's a lot harder for one of these pieces to fall through their cracks because they are visual, they're right on the board. You can see what stage they're currently at, where they're supposed to go next, have they been reviewed. Just makes everything very clear. Another useful idea that the Kanban methodology introduces is that it makes process policies explicit. For example, the one that I had mentioned about having a maximum number of activities in certain columns. That could be part of a team's policy, and it just makes it very obvious for everyone on the team to know what the rule is and if we're currently following the rule or not. Also, if there are certain steps you're supposed to follow for a process, you can see if a task has actually gone through that process or not. It's a lot harder for something to go from the to-do pile all the way to the done or review pile without it being obvious that it skipped the other steps. So it makes it really obvious what the correct process is and are we following it for any given task. And this last part here about implementing feedback loops is far more relevant when you're working with a team. So for example, one of the nice things about having these cards and columns is that then you can measure different metrics and then change your processes based on that. For example, some of the common things people do is they measure how long it takes a card to go from a certain step to another step. So for example, from to do or from in progress all the way to done. And because you can keep track of all these different things, you can figure out which steps in your process are maybe taking a little bit longer, which types of tasks are perhaps jamming up your system. So for example, let's say we have this hard limit of 2 items and we constantly see a certain type of task jamming up the system. Well, for one, you could actually see that because usually this task would live on an individual team member's task list. And in this case, because it's on a board where everybody in the team can see, it's going to become very apparent that this type of task is just taking a really long time, which can then lead us into figuring out why that is. Is this team member struggling because they need software, they need training, they need assistance, they don't have all the pieces they need? So it can help us make the entire process more efficient by detecting all those different little issues that might otherwise stay hidden unless we're constantly asking them. And so now taking a look at how it works, I've essentially just explained that throughout the intro and the key ideas. Like I said, it really is that simple. It's just a column with cards that you're moving from one side to the other as that task progresses through the different steps. And so you're visually seeing the progress of a project taking shape. And again, one of the only other real processes that form the Kanban methodology, especially if you're using it for yourself, is this one right here, which is the work in progress limit. You don't have to be working on a team to set this up for yourself. This is just a really good way to prevent yourself from trying to do too many things at once, preventing yourself from multitasking and then burning out or not giving each individual task the attention it deserves. It's just a really nice way to help you focus on just 1 or 2 things at any given moment. So now going over some of the benefits. Like I said, it increases visibility of the tasks. Where are the bottlenecks? Which are those tasks that are jamming up the system? Those work in progress limits prevent us from multitasking and help us give more focus to each individual task. It's almost paradoxical, but the more you try to multitask, at least I find my work generally is of lower quality, and I end up taking about the same amount of time or maybe even a little bit more than if I were just doing one item after the other in a sequence. And so having a system that artificially limits you or forces you to think about that limit helps you focus. And I already mentioned a little bit how it enables faster issue detection when the Kanban board is part of a team and you're seeing the different tasks move across the board. It's very easy to see how long something is taking as it moves across the board. That's actually another metric that some people use with the Kanban board. They use some sort of a time tracker or a date when a card enters process and when it exits, especially if some of these tasks take a couple of days. Then it becomes very clear when certain tasks are taking a very long time to get through the entire process. And again, that can start a discussion and investigation into why some of these tasks are taking so long. And like I mentioned, it makes the throughput and cycle time measurable. You can measure a bunch of different things when you're using Kanban methodology. Again, most of these are only really useful when you're on a team, but you could also measure these for yourself. It might be a good exercise just for yourself to figure out where certain activities that might seem like they're very simple and don't take very much time are actually sucking up a lot of that energy and time out of your day. And so, for example, measuring how long it takes for a card to go through the system or which cards are not progressing through the system as quickly as others could help you detect where you're struggling with certain types of activities. And so the Kanban methodology obviously started in the manufacturing sector and has since moved on to the personal productivity space. So there are really 3 main areas where it's currently employed. Like I said, personal productivity, tracking all your daily activities, or using it as a sort of a habit tracker where you're tracking the habits that you want to build and it's just going through from left to right as you actually do those things. In team collaboration, where it's useful for everyone on the team to be able to see what the current project status is, where all the different tasks are, what the different workloads for each member of the team are, what is the overall progress of the project, how close are we to finishing it, which activities are maybe slowing us down and we need to put more resources or time into, and which team members might need some additional help because those tasks are not moving along as quickly as we would like, or they're holding up some other activity. And then whether you're working individually or on a team, the Kanban methodology is pretty good for just general project management. You break it up into all the individual pieces it's going to take to complete the project. And this is especially useful if those tasks follow a similar process. So for example, if you're writing a book, so each page that you write is going to go through a similar process of rough draft, and then a second draft, and then editing, and then a final draft, and so on. And so you're going to be doing the same process over and over, and using something like a Kanban board to keep track of that is a really good idea. You get to see the project materialize over time as it starts from a list of tasks on the left side of the board and ends up into individual complete pages on the right side of the board. So it's also very easy to get a rough idea for how much of the project we still have to do. And finally, we have just a little demo here, which I've had open this entire time, but might as well just use it now. This is one of the most simple layouts you can have. We have a backlog where all the tasks that we're going to want to complete start. Then we have a to-do list, which can be our daily or our weekly task list. These are the ones we've decided that need to be taken care of first. Then once we start working on them, they move over to the in progress column. In the case of this project, there is a review stage. And so that's why we have this column here, but you could swap it out or remove it or change it to whatever makes sense for your particular process. And then once the task has been reviewed, we just move it to done. And we can also see where certain areas or resources are perhaps being underutilized. Let's say that one person is responsible for the review or whatever this column stands for. And we said there's only one task here when there could be three. So that means that these tasks are not moving quite as fast as we would like, or maybe this person is better utilized somewhere else, all kinds of different things. And we can get an idea of that and all kinds of other things by just monitoring the flow of cards from one side of the board to the other. Another nice thing about this, if you're doing it in a team setting, is that this is a nice dashboard that you can use for your meetings. So usually the Kanban methodology is also accompanied by some sort of regular meetings, like a daily meeting or a weekly meeting, or usually a combination of those. Or maybe at the start of each day, you go over the entire board with the team because it's just very quick to browse and see where we might be needing some additional tasks. We have additional capacity, where we're getting stuck with something. This person might let us know that they need additional resources or they are blocked on something they need help with. You could almost really think of it as engineering a flow of information from one side of the board to the other. Where we detect a card is getting blocked, we add additional resources or we delve a little bit deeper and figure out why that is. Where we could have additional capacity, again, we try and utilize that resource in a better way. And all the while we're watching the progress of our project go from one side of the board and fill up the right side of the board. And finally, going over the little productivity system grid that I came up with, I've placed the Kanban methodology in the bottom left-hand corner right here because it is a very simple system, but it is far more process-oriented than task-oriented. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it's far more concerned about the entire process and not any one individual task. So whether you're working by yourself or in a team, if you are interested in optimizing your entire process, whatever workflow you might have, the Kanban methodology is a really good way to do that. In terms of the effort you put into it, I feel it's relatively low. It's just a series of columns and cards moving across. You could really implement it for a project and then skip it for another one, depending on how complex it is, or if you're working with multiple people and you need a little bit more help, especially with coordinating that handoff of one activity being complete and then handing it off to another team member, then this system could be really useful. If it's just you handling your daily tasks, depending on how complex it is and whether it is a process that repeats regularly, then something like this could be useful. Otherwise, it might be creeping into the area of diminishing returns where a simple checklist might be what you need. And then what is this methodology actually going to help us with? It's really geared towards increasing visibility and transparency because the entire workflow is in one single board, like a dashboard. Everyone on the team knows what everybody else is doing, what the current status is of all the different activities, how much work is still left for us to complete this project, and where we might be having issues. So it just really brings into the light all those different things that might otherwise be hidden and might cause issues if everyone on the team is just handling their task management by themselves. If somebody's struggling with a certain type of activity or they're overwhelmed and they say yes to doing a bunch of things that they can't actually handle, sometimes it might be difficult for certain people to speak up about that. And when it's made visible on a board, everybody on the team can obviously see, hey, this person's handling 10 things at once. That's just not sustainable. And now you're not wondering why they can't do it. And so it's easier to set limits of, okay, let's just give them only 2 things to work on at a time. And we got to think really hard about which are the most important to get done first. So if I were to give the Kanban methodology a rating, I would rate it very high because it is still relatively simple. Again, just columns and cards moving across it. But the benefit you get of making everything visual, making it really obvious, just feels really valuable, especially for those reasons that I just mentioned a moment ago. From my experience, there are just a lot of little things around people taking on more tasks than they can handle, or being underutilized, or getting stuck on certain things and then not speaking up. This sort of a system just makes very obvious visually, not just to themselves, but to everybody else on the team. And so it's much more likely that you will detect those issues. And if you're working within a team that is open to collaboration and actually helping each other, then this system could be really beneficial. It really feels like everybody is working towards the same goal. And when you see issues happening here, you're not just more likely to detect them, but actually jump in and try to fix them, unclog whatever is jamming up the system, and finish the project. So that's going to be it for the Kanban methodology. Again, another very simple system. This is the first one I think we've seen that is geared towards the process and not so much the task, while still being relatively simple to just spin and start using. There's not a lot of prep. If you already have a list of tasks that you want to complete for a project, it's very easy to start dumping them on one side and figuring out what those limits are going to be for the different columns. Which columns are you going to need? Are you going to want to tag these tasks so it's easy to see which team member is working on them? Just a couple of little details to figure out. But once that's out of the way, it's relatively simple. And like I said, if the type of work you're doing is also relatively standardized, or the steps that you're taking in that process are roughly the same, you could also employ the system even if you're working by yourself. And it could still be quite beneficial so you don't miss any steps, you don't overwhelm yourself, you don't burn out, you maintain focus on just a couple of important things at once, and you get a visual sense for how work is progressing. So it's still beneficial even if you're working by yourself. So that's going to be it for this video. I hope maybe you learned a thing or two, or perhaps are considering using this, whether for yourself or if you're working on a team, maybe presenting the idea of starting to work this way. Be sure to let me know in the comments what you think, what you'd like to see next. And don't forget to like the video if you thought it was interesting, and subscribe if you want to continue to see more of these productivity system overviews. So I will see you in the next one.